The sterile, quiet air of the first-class cabin was shattered by a piercing cry, a sound of pure infant distress that no one could ignore. Flight attendants rushed back and forth, their professional smiles strained, their movements tight with anxiety. What had begun as a fussy whimper had over the past 20 minutes escalated into a full-blown, throat-tearing scream. Anxious whispers among the elite passengers turned into loud, irritated complaints, the words slicing through the air with practiced disdain. "For this price, you'd expect a certain ambiance," a man in a cashmere sweater muttered to his companion, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's simply inconsiderate," a woman adorned in pearls added, not bothering to lower her voice. "Some of us have business to attend to. We need our rest." In seat 2A, Amelia Corbin squeezed her eyes shut, pretending the hostile glares were not drilling into her back. She clutched her 7-month-old son, Leo, rocking him with a frantic, desperate rhythm that only seemed to make him cry harder. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She was the CEO of Corbin Dynamics, a titan of the tech industry who could silence a boardroom with a single look. She'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced down hostile takeovers, and built an empire from the ground up. But she could not quiet her own child. Leo's face was a mottled red, his tiny body rigid with a misery she couldn't understand or soothe. The formula was the right temperature. His diaper was clean. She'd tried his pacifier, his favorite stuffed giraffe, everything the parenting blogs and books had recommended. Nothing worked. It felt like a public referendum on her motherhood, a role she was already terrified of failing. Her husband, Richard, had made his verdict clear the day she'd shown him the positive pregnancy test. "I'm not ready for this, Em," he'd said, his voice devoid of emotion, "This is your choice, not mine." He had walked out and never looked back, leaving her to face this new, terrifying world alone. Suddenly, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, the usual calm tone replaced with a sharp urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation on board. If there is a doctor or a nurse on this flight, please make yourself known to the cabin crew immediately." A cold spike of fear shot through Amelia. "My God, is it that bad? Is he sick?" She looked down at Leo, whose screams were now punctuated by choked, desperate gasps for air. The flight attendant, a young woman with wide, panicked eyes, was already leaning over her. "Ma'am, is he choking? Is he having trouble breathing?" I don't know," Amelia stammered, her own breath catching in her throat. She was a CEO, a leader. But in that moment, she was just a desperate mother, completely and utterly helpless as the world watched her fail. Further back, beyond the velvet curtains separating the worlds of the wealthy and the weary, Elijah Davis, a black single dad in his mid-30s, felt a familiar ache in his chest. The relentless cries from first class had been a painful soundtrack to his own quiet grief. He and his 7-year-old daughter, Amara, were returning to San Francisco from his mother's funeral, a small, somber affair in a town he hadn't called home in years. He held Amara's hand, her small fingers a grounding presence in the turbulent sea of his sorrow. "That baby sounds really sad, Daddy," Amara whispered, looking up from her worn copy of The Little Prince. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful like her late mother's, were filled with a child's pure, uncomplicated empathy. Her hair was pulled back in neat, dark braids. "He does, sweetie," Elijah murmured, his gaze distant. When the captain's urgent call for a doctor came over the speakers, Elijah's posture straightened. He listened intently, not to the words, but to the sound underneath them, the baby's cry. He closed his eyes, his past life flooding back in an unwelcome rush of memory and sensation. He wasn't a doctor, but he recognized that cry intimately. It wasn't the sharp, panicked sound of physical pain or choking. It was the ragged, cyclical scream of a nervous system pushed far beyond its limits. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated overstimulation. He had spent over a decade learning the language of sound, how certain frequencies could soothe or agitate, how a resonant vibration could speak directly to the primal parts of the human brain. It was the core of his art, the secret to how he'd once made a Stradivarius sing to sold-out concert halls across the globe. That life was gone now, buried under the rubble of lies and a scandal he could never escape, leaving him with nothing but the calloused, dark brown hands of a janitor and the quiet love of his daughter. "Daddy," Amara asked, sensing the shift in him, "are you okay?" He looked at her, at the little girl he had raised from the moment her mother, Nia, had taken her last breath in the delivery room. He had promised himself he would never let her see him break, that he would build a safe, simple life for her, far from the wreckage of his past. Sticking his neck out was a risk. Getting involved was a risk. The world had taught him that kindness was a liability. But then he heard the mother's muffled sob from behind the curtain, a sound of utter despair that resonated deeper than any cello note. He knew that feeling. He had lived it for a year after his wife died, alone with a colicky infant and the crushing weight of the world. He squeezed Amara's hand. "I'm going to go see if I can help," he said softly. "I'll be right back." "Don't you move, okay?" Amara nodded, her expression serious and trusting. Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The walk from economy felt like crossing a border into another country. He pushed past the velvet curtain and stepped into the spacious, hostile territory of first class. All eyes turned to him, his simple jeans and worn jacket a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer labels. The judgment was palpable, a silent question of what this black man from the back of the plane was doing here. He ignored them, his focus entirely on the scene in seat 2A. He saw the mother, her beautiful face streaked with tears, her expensive silk blouse rumpled. He saw the baby flailing and screaming, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of his own darkest days. He approached slowly, calmly, his dark brown hands open at his sides. He stopped beside her seat and waited for her to look up. When she finally did, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He kept his voice low and steady. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I know this is forward, but I might be able to help." Amelia looked up at the stranger, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over her. A black man from economy with kind eyes and worn-out cuffs was witnessing her at her absolute lowest. Her first instinct, honed by years in the corporate world, was to dismiss him, to reassert control. "We have it handled," she started to say, the words automatic and defensive. A flight attendant rushed over, her expression a mix of relief and agitation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. This is a first-class cabin." But Elijah didn't look at the flight attendant. His gaze remained on Amelia, calm and unwavering. It wasn't a look of pity, but of understanding. It was a look that said, "I've been where you are." That simple, unspoken empathy cut through Amelia's armor. She had been surrounded by people for the last hour, attendants, passengers, all offering useless advice or thinly veiled judgment. But this was the first time she hadn't felt completely alone. She held up a hand, silencing the flight attendant. "It's fine," she said, her voice raspy. She turned back to Elijah, suspicion and desperation warring within her. "What do you think you can do?" Elijah didn't offer a lengthy explanation or a list of credentials. He simply met her eyes and asked, "May I?" He gestured gently toward Leo, who was now arching his back, his screams turning into frantic, breathless shrieks. The question hung in the air, a simple request for trust in a moment where she had none left to give. For a long, tense second, she hesitated. Handing her child to a complete stranger on an airplane felt reckless, insane. But then Leo let out another cry, a sound so full of agony it felt like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She nodded, a single jerky motion. With a practiced ease that spoke of countless hours spent with an infant, Elijah gently lifted Leo from her arms. He didn't jiggle or bounce him. Instead, he cradled the baby high on his chest, pressing Leo's tiny ear against the spot where his heartbeat would be the loudest. And then he began to hum. It wasn't a lullaby or any discernible melody. It was a single low-frequency note that seemed to vibrate through the very air in the cabin. The sound was impossibly deep and resonant, almost inhumanly steady, like the lowest note drawn from a cello, designed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the bones. Elijah closed his eyes, his body swaying in a slow, metronomic rhythm, a human anchor in a sea of chaos. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Leo's frantic screaming stopped mid-cry, replaced by a choked, shuddering gasp. His rigid body, which had been fighting Amelia with all its might, went limp against Elijah's chest. The angry red flush on his cheeks began to fade. A few hiccuping sobs escaped his lips, then whimpers, and then silence. His eyelids fluttered, drooped, and then closed. Within 60 seconds, the baby who had terrorized the first-class cabin for the better part of an hour was sound asleep, a tiny fist clutching the fabric of Elijah's worn jacket. The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger was frozen, their mouths agape. The man in the cashmere sweater stared, his snide expression replaced with one of pure disbelief. The flight attendant stood motionless in the aisle, looking at Elijah as if he had just performed an act of impossible magic. The only sound was the steady drone of the airplane's engines. Amelia stared, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. She looked from her son's peaceful, sleeping face to the stranger holding him. It felt like a hallucination. She had used every tool in her considerable arsenal, wealth, power, intelligence, and had failed. This man, with his quiet confidence and a simple, resonant hum, had succeeded in seconds. Carefully, so as not to disturb the sleeping child, Elijah transferred Leo back into her arms, adjusting him so he was in the same position against her chest. "Keep him here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let him feel your heartbeat. Just breathe slow and deep." Amelia took her son, her hands trembling. He felt heavier now, warm and pliant with sleep. She looked up at the man who had given her this impossible peace. The questions came out in a choked whisper. "Who are you?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "My name is Elijah Davis." The name meant nothing to her, which only deepened the mystery. "What do you do, Elijah Davis?" she pressed, her voice regaining a fraction of its usual authority. "Are you some kind of doctor? A therapist?" A flicker of something, sadness perhaps, passed through his eyes before it was gone. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "No, ma'am," he said, the words quiet but clear. "I'm just a janitor." The word hung in the air between them, a stark, unbelievable contrast to the miracle she had just witnessed. A janitor? Her mind reeled. It didn't make sense. The grace in his movements, the profound understanding he possessed, it was impossible. Still trying to process this, she gestured to the empty seat beside her, a plush leather throne that cost more than a round-trip ticket for most people. "Stay," she said, the single word an order, a plea. "Please sit." Elijah looked at the luxurious seat, then glanced back toward the velvet curtain. He gave a polite but firm shake of his head. "Thank you, but I can't," he said, his voice gentle but absolute. "My daughter is waiting for me." Without another word, he turned and walked away. He slipped back through the curtain, disappearing into the other world of economy class as quietly as he had arrived. He left behind a first-class cabin steeped in a stunned silence and a CEO holding her sleeping son. Her world completely upended, her mind raced, the two irreconcilable facts echoing over and over again. Elijah Davis, a janitor. It was a puzzle she didn't understand, but one she knew with every fiber of her being she had to solve. For the remainder of the flight, an unnatural peace settled over the first-class cabin. Leo slept soundly against Amelia's chest, his breathing soft and even. The other passengers, shamed into silence by the quiet drama they had witnessed, kept to themselves. The flight attendants treated Amelia with a new, reverent deference, offering her water, warm blankets, and whispering apologies for the earlier disturbance. She accepted numbly, her mind 1,000 miles away. She couldn't work. The encrypted deal memos on her tablet seemed trivial. The urgent emails from her board of directors unimportant. Her entire focus had narrowed to the puzzle of Elijah Davis, a janitor. The word felt wrong in her mouth. A poorly chosen label for a black man who possessed such an extraordinary gift. She replayed the encounter again and again. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he did it. The quiet confidence, the gentle authority, the complete absence of ego, and the deep, fleeting sadness in his eyes when she'd asked about his profession. It was a crack in a carefully constructed facade, a glimpse of a story he did not want to tell. Amelia Corbin had not gotten to where she was by accepting things at face value. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, found leverage in the smallest inconsistencies. Elijah Davis was the biggest inconsistency she had ever encountered. A man with the hands of a healer and the job title of a custodian. It was a contradiction that set every analytical part of her brain on fire. Gratitude was part of what she felt, a deep, overwhelming wave of it, of But her curiosity was a far more powerful motivating force. She wasn't just grateful to the man who had helped her. She was consumed by the need to understand him. Back in seat 23C, Elijah slid back into the narrow seat beside his daughter. The scent of recycled air and cheap coffee was a grounding, familiar reality after the perfumed luxury of first class. "Did you help the baby, Daddy?" Amara asked, not even looking up from her book. Elijah buckled his seatbelt, the click of the metal latch sealing him back in his world. "I did, sweetie. He's sleeping now." "You have a magic voice," Amara said matter-of-factly, "like you used to use on your big violin." The casual innocence of her words was a punch to the gut. Big violin. That's what she'd called his cello the last time she'd seen it before he'd sold it to pay for his mother's medical bills. Before that, it was the thing that had defined him. Now it was just a ghost. A memory that Amara thankfully was too young to fully grasp. He'd spent 7 years building a wall around that part of his life, brick by painful brick. His brief performance in first class had felt like taking a sledgehammer to it. He had exposed himself, and for what? To help a stranger. It felt both necessary and incredibly foolish. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. He was just a janitor. It was a safe, anonymous life. No one looked twice at the black man who emptied the trash cans and mopped the floors. There were no critics, no rivals, no blinding spotlights. It was a life of shadows, and shadows were safe. He prayed his momentary lapse in judgment wouldn't let the light back in. When the plane finally began its descent into San Francisco, a nervous energy buzzed through the cabin. Amelia felt a pang of regret. Leo was still asleep, and soon the spell would be broken. The man who had helped her would disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. As the seatbelt sign dinged off upon landing, the frenetic energy of life on the ground resumed. Her phone buzzed to life with a dozen messages. Her driver had texted. Her assistant was asking about the schedule for tomorrow's meeting. As a first-class passenger, she was one of the first to deplane. She walked down the jet bridge, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning the river of people flowing from the back of the aircraft. For a moment she considered waiting, finding him to offer a proper thank you, maybe press a $100 bill into his hand, but the thought felt cheap, insulting. What was the right way to thank a man who had performed a miracle? Her driver, a stoic man named George, was waiting for her just past the gate, holding a sign with her name on it. He took her bags, and her personal assistant's voice was already buzzing in her ear through her AirPods, rattling off a list of tasks and appointments. Amelia was swept back into the current of her life, a world of relentless efficiency and forward momentum. But as she was being guided toward the private exit for black car services, she saw them. Across the bustling terminal, standing in the long, snaking line for public taxis, were Elijah and Amara. He held a single scuffed suitcase in one hand and Amara's small hand in the other. He leaned down to listen as Amara pointed excitedly at a large advertisement on the wall. They looked so ordinary, so self-contained, a tiny island of quiet dignity in an ocean of noise and haste. The image burned itself into her mind, her world of private drivers and velvet ropes, his of public lines and a single suitcase. The moment she slid into the cool leather interior of the town car, she pulled out her phone. Her assistant was still talking. "Clara," Amelia interrupted, her voice sharp and clear. "Yes, Miss Corbin." "Cancel my 4 o'clock and I have a job for you. It's a priority, of course." "What do you need?" Amelia looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully in the state-of-the-art car seat that had been waiting for him. Then she looked out the window as the skyline of San Francisco slid into view. She was back in her element, a place where information was power and anything could be bought or found. "I need you to find someone," she said, her tone leaving no room for questions. "His name is Elijah Davis. He was on my flight. He told me he's a janitor. Find everything, Clara. His address, his work history, where he went to school. I want to know who he really is." The taxi ride from SFO was a quiet one. Amara, exhausted from the travel and the emotional weight of the past few days, rested her head against Elijah's shoulder and watched the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest building in the outer Richmond, a neighborhood where the fog rolled in thick, and the sound of the distant foghorn was a constant, comforting companion. It was small, with two tiny bedrooms and a living room that smelled of old books and the lemon polish Elijah used on the floors. But it was meticulously clean and filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the rattling old heater in the corner. This was their sanctuary, the small safe world he had built for them. As Elijah tucked Amara into her bed, she looked up at him, her eyes heavy with sleep. Is Grandma an angel now with Mommy, Nia? Elijah's throat tightened. He smoothed her natural coiling hair back from her forehead. She is, sweetie. They're together. Okay, she whispered, and a moment later, she was asleep. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Every decision he made, every sacrifice was for her. His job as a janitor paid the bills. It kept a roof over their heads. It was anonymous, thankless work performed in the dead of night, but it was steady. It was safe. He pushed the memory of the airplane, the scent of expensive perfume, the shocked faces, the gratitude in a beautiful woman's eyes out of his mind. That was not his world. It was a place he had visited by accident and to which he must never return. Miles away, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the glittering expanse of the Golden Gate Bridge, Amelia Corbin stood in a different kind of silence. Hers was a vast, echoing quiet, punctuated only by the hum of a state-of-the-art air filtration system. A professionally trained night nurse had already whisked Leo away to his perfectly appointed nursery, and the silence he left behind was a hollow ache. The apartment, featured in 3 architectural magazines, was a monument to minimalist luxury. It was all clean lines, polished concrete, and floor-to-ceiling glass. It was stunning, and it was profoundly empty. It was a place to impress people, not to live. She paced the length of the enormous living room, a glass of wine in her hand, her phone resting on the marble island in the kitchen. She had told herself to be patient, that Clara needed time, but patience was not a virtue she possessed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elijah Davis's face, heard that impossible, calming hum. Her phone buzzed late the next afternoon. It was Clara. I have something for you, Miss Corbin, her assistant said, her voice crisp and efficient. It's more complicated than I anticipated. Amelia's heart beat a little faster. Go on. I located him easily enough, Clara began, the sound of typing clicking in the background. Elijah Davis, age 36. He resides at 745 Balboa Street. He has 1 dependent, a daughter, Amara, age 7. He's employed by Citywide Cleaning Solutions. His primary nightly assignment is the Ellison Tower on Montgomery Street. Amelia felt a strange, illogical pang of disappointment. It was all true then. He really was just a janitor. The mystery was a fabrication of her own overtired mind. But Clara continued, her tone shifting. That's where the straightforward information ends. His employment with Citywide began 7 years ago. Before that, his work history is a ghost. There's nothing. No tax records, no pay stubs, nothing. And his education, Miss Corbin, are you sitting down? Just tell me, Clara. He was a student at the Juilliard School in New York. The world tilted slightly on its axis. Juilliard, the premier arts conservatory on the planet? That's impossible, Amelia breathed. It gets stranger, Clara said. His records are sealed. It took a significant amount of persuasion and a call to a very well-placed contact just to confirm his attendance. He was in the music division, cello. Amelia sank onto a white leather sofa, the wine glass forgotten in her hand. A cellist, of course. The resonant hum, the perfect pitch, the graceful, confident hands. It was all starting to make a terrifying kind of sense. Why would a Juilliard cellist be working as a janitor? I think I'm beginning to find out, Clara said, her voice dropping. The name Elijah Davis triggered alerts on a few deep archive news databases. I'm still trying to get through the firewalls, but the articles are all from around 8 years ago. They're about the San Francisco Symphony. It seems he was something of a prodigy, their star soloist. The articles mention him frequently, often in the same breath as the orchestra's principal cellist at the time, a man named Dorian Mezer. A star soloist. The words hung in the air, electric and unbelievable. He hadn't just been a musician. He'd been brilliant. What could have happened to cause such a catastrophic fall from grace? Get me those articles, Clara, Amelia commanded, her mind racing, piecing together the fragments. I don't care what it costs or what you have to do. I want to read them. I'm already on it. But Miss Corbin, there's a lot of digital noise around his name from that period. Accusations, a major public scandal. It's messy. I don't care about messy, Amelia said, a new, unshakable resolve hardening in her voice. This was no longer just about solving a puzzle. This was about the profound injustice of it all. A man with that much talent, that much grace, was emptying trash cans in a skyscraper downtown while she was what? Arguing about shareholder dividends. She needed to see him again. Not just to thank him, but to understand. Showing up at his apartment was out of the question. It would be an invasion, a power play. But his work, the Ellison Tower, an idea bold and direct, began to form in her mind. Clara, she said, her voice now cool and decisive, forget the articles for a moment. I have a more urgent task. Find out who is leasing the top floor of the Ellison Tower. I don't care who it is. Find out if the lease is ending soon. If it isn't, find out how much it would cost to buy them out of it. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the first time in 5 years Amelia had ever heard her assistant hesitate. Miss Corbin, you heard me, Amelia said, standing up and walking toward the vast window overlooking the city. Corbin Dynamics is looking for a new satellite office. 2 weeks later, Amelia Corbin stood in the empty, cavernous space of the 48th floor of the Ellison Tower. The scent of fresh paint and new carpet hung in the air. Below her, the lights of San Francisco sprawled out like a blanket of fallen stars. It was a prime piece of corporate real estate with a breathtaking view, a strategic acquisition by any measure. It was also a ridiculously expensive, completely unnecessary, and meticulously engineered excuse. Clara, a master of corporate warfare, had executed her orders with ruthless precision. The previous tenants, a struggling hedge fund, were bought out of their lease in a deal so swift and generous they didn't know what hit them. Corbin Dynamics' new satellite office was officially hers. She had spent the afternoon there going through the motions with a team of architects and designers, discussing glass walls and open concept workflows. All the while, a nervous electric energy coursed through her veins. She had sent them all home hours ago. Now she was alone, waiting. Down in the building's sub-basement, Elijah Davis clocked in for his shift. The familiar rhythm of his routine was a comfort. He changed into the simple gray uniform of Citywide Cleaning Solutions, the familiar weight of the key ring on his belt a grounding presence. He breathed in the acrid smell of industrial-strength disinfectant, a scent that had replaced the sweet, woody aroma of rosin and aged varnish from his past life. He was invisible here, a ghost who haunted the building after the important people had gone home. And that's the way he liked it. He started his rounds on the ground floor and worked his way up. Each floor was a silent, orderly tomb of cubicles and conference rooms. He emptied trash cans filled with crumpled reports and discarded coffee cups, wiped down surfaces, and vacuumed the plush carpets, his movements economical and practiced. By the time he reached the top floors, it was well past 10 o'clock. He knew the 48th floor was newly leased. The work order simply said to do a light pass-through. The elevator doors opened onto a vast, dark space. He pushed his heavy cart out, its rubber wheels squeaking softly on the polished concrete. Then he saw her, a lone figure silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city. He froze, his heart hammered against his ribs. It was her, the woman from the plane, here in his building. It was an impossible coincidence, a statistical anomaly so profound it felt like a distortion of reality itself. His first instinct was to retreat, to get back in the elevator and pretend he hadn't seen her, but it was too late. She had heard him. She turned. Even in the dim light, her presence was commanding. She wasn't feigning surprise. Her gaze was direct, intense. Elijah Davis, she said. It wasn't a question. His throat was dry. He gripped the handle of his cart, a flimsy shield, against her overwhelming presence. Miss Corbin, what are you doing here? My company just leased this floor, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. It was a plausible lie delivered with the practiced ease of a CEO. We're expanding. She took a few steps toward him, pulling an envelope from the pocket of her blazer. I was hoping I might run into you. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did on the plane. She held the envelope out to him. He didn't need to open it to know it contained a check, likely for an amount that could change his life. It was a transaction, the language of her world, power deployed to settle a debt. "That's not necessary, Miss Corbin," he said, his voice stiffer than he intended. He made no move to take the envelope. "I didn't do it for money. I'm just glad I could help you and your son." Her hand remained outstretched for a moment before she slowly lowered it, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. She had expected gratitude, perhaps surprise. His polite refusal had thrown her off script. She changed her approach. "My assistant is very thorough," she said, her tone shifting from appreciative to probing. "She's good at finding things that are misplaced. She told me you attended Juilliard." The words hit him like a physical blow. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. The friendly, humble janitor vanished, replaced by a black man with cold eyes and a defensive posture. He felt exposed, violated. This powerful, wealthy woman had dug into his life, unearthing the very thing he had worked so hard to keep buried. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice flat and hard. He turned and began to push his cart toward the far side of the office. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." "A cellist?" she pressed, walking after him, unwilling to let it go. "You were a star soloist with the symphony. What happened, Elijah? A man with your kind of talent doesn't just end up—" She trailed off, realizing too late how insulting her words sounded. He stopped, his back still to her. His dark brown hands were clenched, white-knuckled on the cart's handle. "Ends up what, Miss Corbin?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Pushing a mop? Is that what you were going to say?" He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw the raw anger and pain he kept so carefully hidden. "You have no right," he said, his voice low and shaking with fury. "You have no right to dig through my life because I helped you with your baby. My past is not some puzzle for a bored CEO to solve. It's my life." Amelia flinched. He was right. She had overplayed her hand, treating him like a hostile acquisition, a problem to be analyzed and solved. Seeing the deep wound she had just torn open, she instantly regretted her aggressive tactics. Her voice softened, losing its interrogator's edge. "You're right," she said, the admission costing her more than she expected. "I'm sorry, it's just what you did on that plane was extraordinary. The way you created that sound, it was beautiful. A talent like that is a gift. I don't understand how someone could just walk away from it." Elijah's anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He looked at her, then around the vast, empty floor, a monument to the kind of power and ambition that had once destroyed him. The fight was gone from his eyes, leaving only that familiar sadness she had seen on the plane. He pushed his cart toward the exit, pausing at the door. He looked back at her, a chasm of wealth and experience separating them. "Some things, once they're broken, can't be fixed, Miss Corbin," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Good night." He stepped out, the door closing with a soft hiss behind him, leaving her completely alone in the echoing silence of the 48th floor. She had found him, but in doing so she had pushed him further away than ever. Amelia stood alone in the dark, cavernous office for a long time, the silence pressing in on her. Elijah's final words echoed in the space, a quiet, devastating verdict. Some things, once they're broken, can't be fixed. He wasn't just talking about his past. He was talking about her clumsy, arrogant attempt to connect with him. She had treated him like a corporate mystery, a problem to be solved with pressure and resources. And in doing so, she had confirmed his worst assumptions about her and the world she represented. She was used to getting what she wanted. When a negotiation stalled, she applied more pressure. When a rival blocked her path, she found a way to go over, under, or straight through them. But Elijah Davis wasn't a rival. He was a man who had shown her a moment of profound, selfless kindness, and she had repaid him by treating his life's greatest trauma like a fascinating case study. For the first time in a very long time, Amelia felt a deep, unfamiliar pang of shame. Her methods had failed. She needed a new strategy. The next morning, a secure, encrypted file arrived in her inbox from Clara. The subject line was simple: RC Archives. Amelia cleared her schedule for the rest of the day, locked her office door, and told her staff she was not to be disturbed. For the next 3 hours, she read. The articles pulled from the digital archives of half a dozen newspapers and magazines painted a brutal and convincing narrative. 8 years ago, Elijah Davis was the toast of the classical music world, a once-in-a-generation talent poised to become the youngest principal cellist in the San Francisco Symphony's history. He was the charismatic, brilliant prodigy, and Dorian Mezer was the established, respected, but less dazzling principal he was set to upstage. The scandal erupted just 2 weeks before the prestigious International Cello Festival, an event where both men were scheduled to perform. The story broke in a salacious arts gossip column. Dorian Mezer's priceless 17th century cello had been vandalized. A corrosive chemical agent had been applied to the strings, eating through them and more tragically seeping into the instrument's delicate varnish, causing thousands of dollars in damage and rendering it unplayable for the competition. The narrative quickly zeroed in on Elijah. Anonymous sources from within the orchestra began to leak stories to the press, painting a portrait of a fiercely ambitious and emotionally unstable young man who was resentful of Mezer's seniority. An email, which Amelia immediately recognized as something that could have been easily taken out of context, was published everywhere. In it, Elijah vented to a friend, writing, "Dorian's technique is flawless, but his soul is missing. It's a tragedy that he's holding that chair." It was spun as definitive proof of a malicious, jealous motive. The final nail in the coffin was a report that a janitor had found a half-empty bottle of the specific chemical in a trash can near the musician's locker room. Dorian Mezer played his part to perfection, giving tearful, magnanimous interviews where he lamented the troubled soul of his young colleague. The symphony's board, terrified of a public relations disaster, suspended Elijah indefinitely. He was never charged with a crime. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, but it didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, he was guilty. He lost his position, his endorsements, and his future. He was blacklisted overnight, and then he simply vanished. Amelia leaned back in her chair, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The story was airtight. It was a flawless character assassination, but it was wrong. Her gut, the finely tuned instinct that had guided every major decision of her life, told her it was a lie. The man who had gently refused her money, who had spoken of his daughter with such quiet devotion, was not the monster in these articles. The rage she'd seen in his eyes last night wasn't the fury of a vindictive rival. It was the pain of a man unjustly cornered. Her eyes kept returning to one name, Dorian Mezer. "Clara," she said into her phone, her voice cold and hard, "I need everything you have on the current principal cellist for the San Francisco Symphony." "Dorian Mezer," Clara replied, without missing a beat. "Already on it. He's a pillar of the arts community, major philanthropist, serves on 3 nonprofit boards. He's considered the face of the orchestra." Clara paused. "There's something else you should know, Miss Corbin. Corbin Dynamics is the lead sponsor for the Symphony's annual Starlight Gala in 3 weeks. You're scheduled to give the opening remarks." Amelia felt a surge of adrenaline. It was perfect, a direct organic path to the man at the center of the web. Her first instinct had been to send a team of private investigators to dig into Mezer's life. But that was the old way of thinking. It was loud, aggressive. It was the same tactic that had failed so spectacularly with Elijah. No, this required finesse. She knew she couldn't approach Elijah again. Not yet. He wouldn't talk to her, and she couldn't blame him. If she wanted to uncover the truth of what had happened 8 years ago, she had to go to the source. She had to dismantle the lie from the inside. She pulled up the symphony's website, her screen filling with a professionally shot photograph of Dorian Mezer. He was smiling warmly, a picture of cultured sophistication, his cello held in a graceful embrace. He looked untouchable, but Amelia had made a career out of dismantling untouchable things. She saw past the philanthropic facade to the calculating rival underneath. He had broken Elijah, and in doing so he had silenced a rare and beautiful gift. And that was something Amelia could not abide. "Clara," she said, her decision made, "confirm my attendance at the gala, and I want you to arrange a private meeting with Mr. Mezer for next week. Tell him I want to discuss a possible expansion of our corporate sponsorship." "A new endowment, perhaps?" "An endowment?" Clara asked, surprised. We hadn't budgeted for that. We have now, Amelia said, her eyes fixed on Dorian's smiling face. The hunt had changed. It was no longer a passive investigation. It was an active campaign. She was going to step into Dorian Mezer's world, armed with a checkbook and a smile, and she was going to take it apart, piece by piece. The meeting took place at a private club in Nob Hill, a place of hushed tones, dark wood, and old money. Dorian Mazer was exactly as polished and charismatic as his press photos suggested. He wore a perfectly tailored Italian suit, spoke with a smooth mid-Atlantic accent, and possessed the easy charm of a man accustomed to being admired. He greeted Amelia with a practiced warmth, his eyes conveying a flattering mix of respect for her power and appreciation for her patronage. Amelia played her part with masterful precision. She was the gracious CEO, the enlightened benefactor. She spoke of leveraging corporate capital to enrich the cultural landscape of the city. She floated the idea of endowing a new chair for the orchestra, the Corbin Dynamics Chair for Musical Innovation, a legacy project that would cement both their names in the symphony's history. Dorian was captivated, his ego expertly stroked. He saw in Amelia not just a sponsor, but an ally, a fellow member of the city's elite. As the waiter cleared their plates, Amelia made her pivot. She swirled the wine in her glass, her expression thoughtful. In considering this endowment, I've been doing some research into the symphony's history, she said, her tone casual, looking for patterns of excellence to invest in. I came across the most fascinating story about a young cellist from about 8, maybe 9 years ago. She paused, letting the silence hang for a beat before she delivered the name like a surgical strike. Elijah Davis. What an absolute tragedy that was. Dorian's smile didn't falter, but Amelia, a predator in the boardroom, saw the infinitesimal tells, a slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers momentarily stopped their drumming on the tablecloth. It was a microsecond of disruption in an otherwise flawless performance. He recovered instantly, his face settling into a mask of solemn regret. "Ah, yes, Elijah," he said, sighing dramatically. "A tragedy indeed, a truly staggering talent. It was heartbreaking for all of us. What I read was so sensationalized," Amelia continued, feigning a naive curiosity. "It's hard to get a clear picture. The papers painted him as some kind of monster." "Not a monster," Dorian corrected smoothly, sipping his water. "Just troubled. Elijah was always a very intense young man. Brilliant, of course, but the fire that fueled his music also threatened to consume him. Some people, sadly, are not built to withstand the pressure of that kind of genius. The incident with my cello." He shook his head, the picture of a magnanimous victim. "It was a cry for help, really. I've always believed that." The condescending pity in his voice made Amelia's skin crawl. He had his story polished and perfected over 8 years, and he delivered it with the skill of a master performer. "It just seems so incomplete," she pressed gently, watching his eyes, "for a talent like that to simply vanish, to go from Juilliard and the symphony stage to nothing. It feels like a piece of the story is missing." Dorian placed his napkin on the table, his movements deliberate. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cautionary tone. "Miss Corbin, if I may be frank, you're a very powerful woman, and I can see you have a compassionate heart, but Elijah's story is a dark one. The official version is, shall we say, the sanitized version. It was a mercy in a way that his career ended when it did, for his own good, and for the safety of those around him. A man that unstable, who knows what might have happened otherwise?" It was a veiled threat, a subtle warning. "Stay away. This man is dangerous." He was trying to poison her perception of Elijah, just as he had done with the public 8 years ago. Amelia offered a thoughtful, non-committal nod, allowing him to believe he had succeeded. That night, in the echoing silence of the Ellison Tower, Elijah pushed his mop across the gleaming marble floor of the lobby. He moved with a heavy, lean rhythm. His encounter with Amelia had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. It had cracked the seal on a part of his life he had locked away, and memories were now seeping through like floodwater. He felt exposed. His quiet, anonymous world, no longer a reliable shelter. Every time an elevator door opened, he half expected to see her standing there, ready to ask more questions he couldn't answer. He just wanted to be left alone, to do his job, and go home to his daughter. The meeting with Dorian ended with handshakes and promises to continue their discussion. "I'm so looking forward to the Starlight Gala," Amelia said as they parted, her smile bright and unwavering. "We must speak more then." Back in her car, the mask of the gracious benefactor fell away. She knew with absolute certainty that Dorian Mezer was lying. His performance had been too smooth, his warnings too carefully crafted. He was hiding something. Now she had to find a way to rattle his cage, to force a mistake, and she knew just how to do it. She made a call to Clara. "I need you to do something for me. Send a formal invitation to the Starlight Gala to Mr. Elijah Davis at his home address, hand-delivered, and I want to sign the card myself." The following morning, Elijah arrived home as the sun was beginning to rise. The physical exhaustion of his shift, a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his mind. He walked up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his body aching. As he fumbled for his keys, he saw it. Propped against his door was a thick, impossibly elegant cream-colored envelope. His name and address were written across the front in a graceful, flowing script. It bore the crest of the San Francisco Symphony. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open. Inside was a heavy, embossed invitation to the Starlight Gala, the Symphony's most exclusive and high-profile event of the year. It was an invitation to the very heart of the world that had cast him out. Tucked inside was a small personal note card embossed with the logo of Corbin Dynamics. The message was short, written in a bold, confident hand. "Mr. Davis, I believe you belong here. I've included a ticket for your daughter as well, Amelia Corbin." He stared at the invitation, his heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm in his chest. It was a ticket to his own personal hell, a summons back to the scene of his execution. And it had been sent by the one woman he couldn't seem to escape. For 2 days, the embossed invitation sat on Elijah's small kitchen table, a declaration of war on the quiet life he had so carefully constructed. His first impulse was to rip it into 100 pieces, to burn it and scatter the ashes. The thought of walking into that hall, of facing the symphony of whispers and pitying looks from people who had once called him a friend, was physically nauseating. He would be a ghost at the feast, a walking scandal. And to see Dorian Mezer smiling and triumphant in the heart of it all, it was unthinkable. He was furious with Amelia. This wasn't a kindness, it was a provocation. She was using her power to force his hand, to drag him back into the light so she could satisfy her own curiosity. He resented her for it, for her inability to simply leave him alone. He was composing an angry, polite refusal in his head when Amara came home from school. She spotted the invitation immediately, her eyes widening at the gold crest and elegant script. "Ooh, what's that?" she asked, tracing the raised lettering with her small finger. "It's nothing, sweetie, just junk mail," Elijah said quickly, moving to sweep it into the bin. But Amara was too fast. She picked it up, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to sound out the words. "Starlight Gala," she read slowly. "Is it a party, Daddy?" "A party for a king and a queen." "Something like that," he said, his voice tight. "Can we go?" she asked, her voice alight with a hope that was so pure it hurt him to hear it. "Will there be ladies in big puffy dresses and music like in the movies?" He looked at his daughter, who had never been to a real party, whose nicest dress was the simple black one she had just worn to her grandmother's funeral. Her life was filled with love, but it was a small, quiet life, devoid of the magic and sparkle that every child deserved to experience at least once. He saw the invitation not through his own eyes, clouded with fear and trauma, but through hers. To her, it wasn't a summons to his past, it was a ticket to a fairy tale. His anger at Amelia began to recede, replaced by a painful, warring conflict. To protect himself, he had to say no. But to give his daughter this one night of wonder, a memory of beauty to hold against the grief of the past few weeks, he had to say yes. He had spent 7 years running. Maybe it was time to stand still just for one night, for her. "Okay, sweetie," he heard himself say, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "We'll go." The preparations were a surreal, poignant exercise. His old tuxedo had been sold long ago. He rented one from a dusty shop downtown, a garment that smelled of mothballs and a dozen other men's fleeting celebrations. It was a passable fit, but it felt like a costume. For Amara, he found a deep blue velvet dress at a second-hand boutique, a small treasure hidden among racks of discarded clothes. When she put it on and twirled in front of their small living room mirror, her face radiant with joy, he knew he had made the right decision. As he adjusted his own bow tie that evening, he stared at his reflection. The black man looking back at him was a stranger, a ghost of the confident, celebrated musician he used to be, trapped in the tired body of a janitor. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it was something else, something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of defiance. The Starlight Gala was a tidal wave of opulence. The grand foyer of Davis Symphony Hall glittered under the light of a dozen massive chandeliers. A sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos flowed over the marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of champagne flutes clinking. Amelia stood near the grand staircase, a vision in a simple but stunning emerald green dress. She was in her element, navigating conversations with politicians and philanthropists, but her eyes kept straying to the entrance, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. What if he didn't come? What if she had pushed too far? And then she saw him. Elijah and Amara didn't make an entrance. They simply appeared, materializing at the edge of the crowd like apparitions from another world. He in his slightly too short rented tux, and she in her simple velvet dress, holding her father's hand as if it were a lifeline. They were an island of quiet reality in an ocean of glittering performance. A hush fell over their immediate vicinity, followed by a ripple of whispers that spread through the foyer like a virus. Heads turned, eyes widened in recognition. My God, is that Elijah Davis? I thought he'd left the country. What is he doing here? Look at him. Dorian Mezer was holding court near the main ballroom, a circle of admirers hanging on his every word. He felt the shift in the room's energy and looked up. Across the sea of faces, his eyes met Elijah's. For a heartbeat, Dorian's charming mask slipped. His face went rigid with shock, then flushed with a dark, venomous anger. He recovered in an instant, his lips pulling back into a tight, welcoming smile. But the look in his eyes was one of pure murder. Elijah felt the venom from across the room, but he didn't look away. He held his ground, his hand tightening protectively on Amara's. He had come here for his daughter, and he would not be intimidated. Amelia saw it all. She saw Elijah's quiet defiance. She saw the crowd's cruel whispers, and she saw the undisguised hatred in Dorian's eyes. She had set this in motion. Now she had to finish it. With a polite murmur to the senator she had been speaking with, she detached herself from her group. The room seemed to hold its breath as she started to move. Every eye in the foyer followed her as she crossed the vast marble floor, her steps measured and deliberate. She wasn't just walking toward a guest. She was making a statement, drawing a line in the sand for the entire city to see. Her path was direct, her purpose unmistakable. Her eyes locked on the disgraced janitor and his little girl. The whispers died as Amelia came to a stop in front of Elijah and Amara. The entire foyer, filled with the city's most powerful and influential people, had become a silent theater with 3 actors on its stage. Amelia ignored the dozens of staring eyes. She knelt, her emerald green dress pooling on the marble floor, bringing herself to eye level with the small girl in the velvet dress. You must be Amara, she said, her voice warm and gentle. My name is Amelia. That is the most beautiful dress I have ever seen. Amara, who had been hiding behind her father's leg, peeked out. She gave a shy, tentative smile. Thank you. My daddy got it for me. He has excellent taste, Amelia said, smiling back. Then she rose to her full height and finally looked at Elijah. The noise of the crowd, the weight of their judgment, all of it seemed to fade away. In her eyes, he saw a potent mixture of apology for putting him in this position and a fierce, unwavering admiration that he had found the courage to come. Elijah, she said, her voice soft but clear, thank you for being here. Before he could answer, a smooth, booming voice cut through the air. Elijah, my dear boy, what a wonderful surprise. Dorian Mezer glided toward them, his public smile plastered on his face. He was the gracious host, the benevolent king, welcoming a long-lost subject back to the court. He extended a hand to Elijah, an act of performative forgiveness for all to see. It's been too long. And Miss Corbin, I see you've met our former colleague. Elijah ignored the offered hand. Amelia stepped slightly forward, positioning herself between the two men. Mr. Mezer, she said, her voice cool and pleasant. Yes, Mr. Davis and I are acquainted. In fact, I was just thinking how much Corbin Dynamics believes in second chances and in correcting past mistakes. The veiled warning was unmistakable. Dorian's smile tightened. He turned his attention back to Elijah, his voice dripping with condescension. We've all missed your talent, of course. I do trust you've been keeping well. The question was a poisoned dart designed to remind everyone of Elijah's supposed instability. Elijah felt Amara squeeze his hand, and it grounded him. He looked directly at the man who had destroyed his life, not with the anger he had harbored for years, but with a quiet, unshakable peace he hadn't known he possessed. I have a wonderful daughter, Dorian, and a life I'm proud of, he said, his voice steady and clear enough for those nearby to hear. So, yes, I've been very well. The simple, dignified answer was a more effective blow than any accusation. It reframed the entire narrative. Elijah wasn't the tragic figure. He was the father, the survivor. It was Dorian in his hollow, gilded world who suddenly seemed lacking. Seeing her opening, Amelia moved in for the kill. She turned to Dorian, her voice ringing with the icy authority of a CEO about to execute a hostile takeover. She made sure to project, her words carrying across the suddenly silent foyer. Mr. Mezer, I was very serious about the Corbin Dynamics endowment for the symphony, she began. The board members in the crowd leaned in, their expressions eager. However, after careful consideration, I'm adding a new, non-negotiable condition to the gift. She paused, letting the tension build, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing back on Dorian. I will fund a full, independent, and transparent investigation into the events and accusations surrounding Mr. Davis's dismissal 8 years ago. My company's name will not be attached to an institution with such a serious, unresolved question mark hanging over its integrity. True excellence, which this endowment is meant to foster, cannot be built on a foundation of lies. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Dorian's face went chalk white. He was trapped. To refuse the investigation was to admit guilt and lose the largest donation in the symphony's history. To accept it was to invite the scrutiny that could expose him. Amelia had turned his night of triumph into a public tribunal. The room erupted into a flurry of frantic whispers. Panicked board members began to converge, their faces a mixture of fury and fear. In the center of the storm, Elijah leaned down to Amara. I think the fairy tale is over for tonight, sweetie, he whispered. He had done his part. He had shown up. The rest was no longer his fight to win, but hers. He looked at Amelia, and in his eyes she saw a look of stunned, overwhelming gratitude that was more valuable than any endowment. Thank you, he mouthed to her. He then took Amara's hand, turned his back on the chaos, and with his head held high, walked out of the symphony hall, leaving his past behind for others to fight over. As soon as Elijah was gone, Dorian's composure finally shattered. He turned on Amelia, his face a mask of rage, his voice a venomous hiss. You have no idea what you've just done, he snarled, all pretense of charm gone. You will regret this. Amelia didn't flinch. She met his fury with a gaze as cold and hard as diamond. The investigation begins Monday, she said, her voice low and final. I suggest you find a very good lawyer. In the back of a taxi, Amara fell asleep on Elijah's lap, her small hand clutching a chocolate cookie she had managed to snatch from a passing tray. The adrenaline from the confrontation began to fade, leaving Elijah feeling strangely light. He looked out the window at the familiar streets of his city, but they looked different now. For 7 years he had been a ghost, haunted by the injustice of his past. Tonight, someone had finally seen him. Someone had believed him. He didn't know what would happen next, what horrors an investigation would dredge up. But for the first time since he had lost everything, the suffocating weight on his chest had begun to lift. He felt a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. The weeks following the Starlight Gala were a whirlwind of quiet, brutal efficiency. Amelia's investigation team, a formidable group of forensic accountants and former federal investigators, descended on the symphony's 8-year-old records. They unearthed a digital trail Dorian Mezzer had believed long buried, encrypted emails to the gossip columnist who first broke the story, archived financial statements showing a large, unexplained cash transfer to a recently retired orchestra member, and most damning of all, a sworn affidavit from a former stagehand who admitted to planting the chemical bottle near Elijah's locker in exchange for a promotion. The lie, so carefully constructed, crumbled under the weight of unrelenting truth. Dorian's downfall was as swift and public as Elijah's had been. The story was a media firestorm. The hero of the arts community was revealed as a vindictive fraud. He was fired by the symphony's board, stripped of his philanthropic titles, and faced a barrage of lawsuits. Justice, served cold after 8 long years, was absolute. In a desperate act of damage control, the symphony's chairman called a press conference. He offered a profound public apology to Elijah Davis, and in a grand gesture of restitution, formally offered him his old position back, star soloist and principal cellist of the San Francisco Symphony. The world that had been stolen from him was handed back on a silver platter. A week later, Amelia found herself standing outside Elijah's apartment building, a place far from her world of penthouses and private clubs. She wasn't there as a CEO or a benefactor. She was there as a woman who had set a revolution in motion and needed to see the man at the center of it. She knocked, her heart beating with an unfamiliar nervousness. Elijah opened the door. He wasn't celebrating. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft sound of Amara practicing piano scales in the other room. He looked tired, but the deep, weary sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet clarity. "I heard the news," she said softly. "Congratulations, I guess." He smiled, a genuine, easy smile, and stepped aside to let her in. "Thank you, Amelia, for everything." They sat in his small, comfortable living room. "So," she began, unable to hold back the question, "when is your first performance back?" Elijah looked around the room at the walls covered in Amara's crayon drawings, at the worn but beloved armchair in the corner. "I'm not going back," he said simply. Amelia was stunned into silence. "What? But they offered you everything. Your name is cleared. You won." "Won, did I?" he mused, his gaze distant. "You know, for 7 years I dreamed of the moment my name would be cleared. I imagined it would feel like this huge, triumphant victory, but it doesn't. It just feels quiet." He turned to her, his eyes sincere. "That world, Amelia, the pressure, the politics, the endless travel, it almost broke me once. I can't put my daughter through that. I can't become that man again." "Then what will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The Bayview Community Music Center offered me a job," he said, a spark of genuine excitement in his eyes. "Teaching cello and music theory to kids in the neighborhood, kids who would never get a chance to even hold an instrument like this." He gestured to an old, familiar shape in the corner of the room. A beautiful dark wood cello was resting on a stand, an instrument she hadn't seen before. "I bought it back," he said, answering her unspoken question. "The one I sold for my mom." Amelia looked at him, at this man who had been offered the world and had chosen a small classroom in a struggling neighborhood instead. He had chosen a life of meaning over a life of fame, a life for his daughter over a life for the critics. It was the single most powerful, most admirable decision she had ever witnessed. "That," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "is the most incredible thing I've ever heard." He moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "You did this, you know," he said, his voice low. "You didn't just give me back my name, you gave me the freedom to choose what I do with it." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. The space between them, once filled